here. This is our first podcast of 2026. Welcome to Growing Good Humans. I'm so excited to be here today. As most of you know, my name is Laura Barr. I'm the founder and owner of Emerging Educational Consulting, where we provide one-to-one mentorship for parents and students from the beginning to end of the college application process. When people ask me what I do, I tell them that I wake up every day to grow good humans. And what a better way to grow good humans than to empower ourselves with information. And today we are really lucky to have a team of psychologists coming from Aus Adwan's practice, Birch Psychology. Dr. Elly and Dr. Kim are here today to talk to us about executive function. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I feel like it's one of the most powerful tools students can have to do well in life and college and school. And it's something that we don't talk enough about. So Dr. Kim and Dr. Elly, I'm going to have you Dr. Kim, why don't you start and just do a quick bio, and then Dr. Elly, and then let's just dive into the numerous questions that I have for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for such a warm introduction, Laura. So my name is Dr. Kim Yoshino. I'm a Birch psychologist in training. I'm technically a postdoctoral psychologist, finishing up my training over there. Before becoming a school psychologist in my training, I was a former teacher. I taught first grade, and I love the way that psychology can be merged with education in that field. And so over at Birch, I've been able to do quite a bit of therapy and assessments and have a budding interest and growing expertise in giftedness and choice exceptionality. So executive functioning is something I run into every day and talk about often, and I'm excited to talk with you all more about it today.
Awesome.
Dr. Elly?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Dr. Elly Maris. I'm one of the licensed psychologists at Birch Psychology. I do a lot of therapy and also assessment, primarily for school-aged kiddos. Some of my passions are ADHD and autism, also with giftedness. My background is in school psychology, so I have a terminal master's degree in school psychology as well. Did some school-based work before I moved on to the private practice world. So I really, really love collaborating with families, making them feel empowered, and being able to be that bridge from home to school, which is so important.
I was telling you before we started the podcast that my background with Birch Psychology is really related to connecting these things in psychology to real life practice in education, in life, and launching students. And so I think the executive function has become a buzzword, but I also think there's still families who don't fully understand what is executive function and why is adolescence such a critical window for having these kind of conversations. Elly, why don't you start, and then we'll kind of bump off of each other.
Yeah, totally. So executive function is something that we use all the time. It's basically a set of mental skills that helps us plan, organize, start tasks, stay focused, manage time, regulate emotions, and really just follow through on all of those things. So some examples, if you can imagine, are getting out the door on time, remembering deadlines, switching between tasks, managing frustration whenever something's hard, and also sticking with something when our motivation gets low. And so when we think about teens and their executive function, especially when they go to college, they're often expected to act like adults in terms of responsibility, but their brains are still getting to know these skills and practicing these skills. So that's when we really see this mismatch kind of come up where kids will procrastinate or be disorganized, miss deadlines, maybe emotionally shut down or become overwhelmed because they haven't mastered these skills quite yet. And college really places heavy management demands on executive function, but there's also less structure when you go to college. There's fewer reminders and check-ins. You're really having to do a lot of these things independently, and then also balance academics, you're doing your laundry, your social life, your sleep, your self-care. And so when we think of teens going off to college and even high school seniors, this set of skills becomes so much more important for their success and really just their general overall well-being than ever before in their lives.
What is the difference, Dr. Kim, between kind of a normal, I raised four kids who are now in their 20s and 30s. And, executive function is hard for anyone. Then you add a diagnosis of neurodiversity on top of that. And at what point do we get panicked? Like, my student, it's not just normal executive function that we all have to manage to an executive function deficit. And how do we measure if it's just kind of normal issues or if it's something more?
Yeah, well, to be honest, that's a increasingly more complicated question, I think, especially as we're in an era post-COVID where a lot of people started to see executive dysfunction and challenges because a lot of those supports and things that were really helpful, like what Elly just mentioned, were kind of taken away. So I noticed that with the kids that we have coming in, there's a change in what is expected for them, but also in the developmental milestones that they had. Not only is this kind of, 30,000 foot view of the post-COVID week a big thing for us to consider, but it's also the generation of kids that we're working with and how technology and screen time has been part of their development. When we think about typical development for executive functioning skills, we're really going to hone in on the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of the brain that lives right behind your forehead. We've all got it. Everybody has theirs at different stages. But there's a lot of development that goes on here that really plays into how this shows up in just everyday functioning. So general typical development, we really see a rapid growth spurt in prefrontal cortex area between ages 10 and 15. This is really where focus of basic planning comes in, impulse control, longer attention spans start to develop. Before this, it's really just whispers, but here we start to see it coming online in that early adolescence age. And then followed by some gradual refinement, where 15 to 18, we're seeing complex skills like prioritizing and multitasking coming online. And then when we get to mid to late 20s, that's when we really start to see like, okay, this is done cooking, the brain is done baking, and we're seeing that refinement through just the brain being able to err on the side of efficiency in those skills. So I think the point of panic really comes in when we start to see the behavioral or external things falling apart for our kids. So when they're having a really hard time managing their schoolwork, when they're having difficulty within their friendships, when that skill is here, but the demand is here, that gap as it increases over time, when we start to see those skills lagging and they can't do it independently, is when we know, okay, we've got to step in and this is where we need to provide some extra support.
That was a great answer. Let's go back a little bit, though. I'm kind of intrigued with either of you articulating how COVID and this technology piece has impacted and changed the brain. My kids are all in their late 20s, so we were pre-COVID and pre-technology chaos. So I'm not familiar with raising that kind of a brain. What really is different?
Yeah, well, I can kind of hone in on the technology piece. I think this is a key central focus and question that a lot of parents are having to ask right now. And socially, it's a really big point of interest for us as we're navigating how do we raise kids in this new era. I think contextually, a lot of technology and social media has developed, and it's creating this kind of culture where our kids and teens have grown up in a time where they don't know anything different. I mean, the iPad was invented in 2007, the iPhone in 2010, like that era, social media, I think Facebook came online in 2004. So for many of us, we're like, this is everyday stuff. But for many of our teens and kids, they don't know a life without it. And we know there's been a lot of research lately in this area. So in some large, well-designed brain studies that include kind of MRI studies that follow kids over time, we're seeing a few consistent patterns. So specifically, it's related to the amount of time that kids spend on screens. So the higher amount of time that kids spend on screens, especially when it's related to recreation and things that are fun, or some of these fast-paced digital media that kids are interacting with, they're actually showing physiological differences in the way that their prefrontal cortex develops, as well as how it connects to other parts of the brain. So specifically, higher screen time is associated with weaker connectivity within the prefrontal cortex itself, between the prefrontal cortex and the reward center of the brain. And then we're also seeing lower or reduced growth in that area of the brain in general. Now, I say this with caution, as it doesn't mean that technology is damaging kids' brains, but what it does suggest is that the brain is going to adapt to what it practices most. So when our kids are engaging on screens for, with short content that takes 30 seconds or less. I mean, I remember when Vine came out with 6-second clips, right? They're front loaded with high demand and increased stimuli that really captures their attention and keeps them there. And so that kind of media and in large amounts of screen time can make that system, that prefrontal cortex, less efficient over time. And for what we know with prefrontal cortex development, it kind of develops in almost like soil in contrast to what social media and technology creates in that soil. So specifically, prefrontal cortex development does well with, types of tasks and environments that cause frustration, where kids are going to have to navigate that with sustained effort, things that are difficult and challenging and actually demand us to be able to push through and work through the resistance that we feel, as well as in practice with waiting for things. All of those things are very vastly different from this almost instant gratification culture that comes from media. And so it is really difficult for these kids and teens' brains, because basically we've handed kids adult level technology before their brains have had the time to finish installing their planing software.
Wow.
They're developing executive functions in a world that really moves faster than their brain was ever meant to. And so we just have to be cautious with understanding that technology doesn't break the brain, but it definitely trains the brain, and the brain is adaptable. So what kind of stuff are we feeding the brain?
Wow, that just articulates so much what we have been feeling like when I think about 10 years ago when we were working with students who are headed to college, even if they were diagnosed with, if they had a neurodiverse profile, we were still seeing a lot more success in the kind of launch to college. Now, often, even whether neurodiverse or neurotypical, we're seeing everyone struggling with that transition, to the point where this past year we launched an executive function coaching practice geared towards this idea of transitioning to high school to college. We also serve kids who are younger, because we're also seeing the more practice you get younger, the more it ingrains. And it's amazing if you start with a middle school student and start teaching them some of these tools, how much they can implement them with great ease. And it's just knowing what the tools are. Dr. Elly, what's your opinion about building those tools? I mean, obviously it's a combination between parents and schools and coaches and teachers, but I'm just curious if you could give us a success story or something like that, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, to Kim's point, technology isn't harmful in itself, right? But it's really the way it's designed is to compete with executive function, with our brain's executive system. And so the way that I like to think about kind of using technology for good, and ways that I've really seen it be impactful for kids as young as 7th or 8th grade, even in my experience, all the way through high school with these families that we're working with, it's pretty simple in terms of how we can use technology to really support and how it can be good for our executive function. So, first of all, planning and organizing, right? That's really what we think of when we think about executive function. That's, how do we support kids and teens in keeping track of assignments, responsibilities, deadlines? So some things that can be really helpful are having digital calendars and task lists that can externalize their memory. So it's somewhere else where they don't have to hold it all in their brains. And that can really help reduce the cognitive load. Also color coding and within that digital calendar, so that everything can live in one place instead of in their head. And, Kim and I were actually just talking about this. We don't really have a recommendation of one specific app or one, specific kind of end all be all of how we should do this. What's really important is that you and your kids build it yourself. So it becomes really individualized how we do it. And that is really some of what I do in session with families is, okay, given your unique traits as a family, what your son or your daughter needs, we're going to create a system that works for you. So that planning and organizing is so important. Another thing that we really see is time management, but also time awareness. So that's understanding how long things actually take. And so, you know, a lot of times kids might be missing deadlines. They might be rushing last minute to get something done. And so we really want to support using timers and alarms to kind of create this sense of time passing. And that's even chunking if there's a 30-minute task, or maybe there's 30 minutes of math homework, right? Maybe having a timer every 10 minutes to check in and say, how are things going at this 10 minutes? How about at 20 minutes, right? Being able for the kids to see, I'm a third of the way through, I'm 2/3 of the way through, I've got 5 minutes left, so that they can really understand, okay, maybe I can do a front to back sheet in 30 minutes. Maybe it takes me 15 minutes. Maybe an essay takes me this amount of time. But just so they can take that skill into their next phase of life in college. You know, we can also talk about attention and focus. There's definitely focus apps that can work by like blocking out or, you know, kind of shutting down those really tempting social media platforms while you want to engage in some focused kind of deep work during work periods. And then there's also things that support regulation, like white noise or music apps, and really just having those tools that you need in order to stay focused and work your way through a task.
I'm so happy that you said this, because I was nervous before we were meeting because we were going to be talking about technology. I even told Kim before you came on, Elly, I'm like, in our practice, we're virtual and we have a bucket load of tools but they're mostly apps. They're mostly technology, right? Because we can use the Pomodoro method. We can use, for our older students, they're really into the Atom app, which is the atomic habit stacking app. And then of course there's Freedom, which is the app that kind of blocks different, you know, social media things. If you're going to focus, and you can set the time, I want to do it for 2 hours. And so I was like, I was really afraid you were going to be like, don't use those. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So it's, and actually I think it's really interesting too, because I think if I were to advise a family on picking someone who was going to help them, you really would want someone to see the client in front of them. Like, I see you, and this is what your family and your systems can manage. And also, what is the cognitive loading of information that you may give at a given period of time. It may be like, we're going to tackle planning first. The very first thing we're going to do is like get 3 out of your 10 homework assignments in this week, as opposed to all of a sudden do all 10. Right? Like really chunking the expectations so that we see success over time. Does that seem consistent with what you would say?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we can't just tell teens, hey, go use this app, it works for me, right? We really have to walk them through it, understand it. If we are using an app, figure it out and really sit down with them and coach them on it. And if maybe an app doesn't meet all their needs, being able to really understand what system needs to be created for your teen. And it comes from, you know, the top down. So being organized as a family, having those systems in place at a family system level where kids are engaged in, you know, calendar making, and you're following through and you're pointing those things out can just be so helpful, just so they understand and then can take the skills that you've naturally taught them over the years and bringing them into their college dorm, and having, you know, that visual calendar on their, you know, dorm board, or being able to set the timers or the alarms for certain things, reminders, right? Because they've seen you do it. So it really is like leading by example in that way too.
You know, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the impulse control, attention, working memory piece, because that one, especially for students who have diagnoses of ADHD, it feels like somehow that feels related to executive function, but I'm also noticing it feels like a lack of education on what encoding means. Like, how do we really learn something new? And then how do we retrieve it when we need it? And I know this wasn't in anything we had talked about, but it just feels like, especially with that working memory, we're missing something around that conversation. Dr. Kim, I don't know, you're shaking your head like you know what I'm talking about. I'm not even sure what I'm talking about, so maybe you can help fill it out.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you ask is just how do we support those specific skills, as generalization or even addressing those seems a little bit stickier than maybe some of these other things. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And I like what you said, generalization, right? Like, how do we generalize these things that are often a little more elusive than like, we're going to create planning and prioritization?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the answer is a little more nuanced, especially with those things. So in the instance of impulse control, that I like to think a little bit more about like being the fruit of the tree, and the things that help support impulse control are more of the root of the tree. So if we have kids that are impulsive, that struggle with, making different decisions or pausing before they're doing things without thinking, we really want to start to build this kind of deeper process within their brains where they have more of that control and awareness. And there's some research that talks about how mindfulness is really important for building impulse control and attention specifically. And so mindfulness apps are really great. I think Headspace has some, Calm has some. And so you can start, some of these are starting as low as 1 minute of mindfulness and then increasing from there. So starting at a place that feels achievable, right? We don't want to set the goal too high. I'm going to do 30 minutes of mindfulness, right? That doesn't always feel approachable for our teens, especially if they have been consuming a lot of social media or on their screens for a long time. We're going to have to set the threshold lower and then fade support over time as we increase the bar, and they have those skills increasing over time as well. So things like that we really want to be mindful of. In particular with working memory, it's a little more, I think, complicated because there's a lot of different types of memory. Working memory, we can kind of think about like our brain being like a whiteboard. And if we throw information on the whiteboard, we use it really fast and then we wipe it off, right? It's this, we use it when we're getting phone numbers from people that we know for the first time. It's this quick use of information that we then don't encode into our long-term memory. And so when we're thinking about generalization, we're going to have to approach it from multi-pronged different things, right? We're going to have to start with the attention, because you can't remember something if you didn't focus. And then once that has been addressed, then we can practice regurgitating it. Sometimes even writing something the analog way with our hands helps us to have a better encoding in our memory. So we can offline something, and then once that skill has mastered, reintroduce technology and throwing it on our notes app or referring to it later in a different section of our notebook on a sticky note. And then that can help with some of that working memory down the road.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. Let's see if I have any questions. I have one here that says, are there a few high impact shifts parents can make today that could begin moving the needle?
I would say unstructured screen time. I don't know, just being able to really understand how much your child is engaging and just sitting on a screen without it being, with kind of like having that fractured or fragmented attention piece, that instant gratification, because that can be so harmful to our brains. So my suggestion, or like my like high impact thing, would be to get to know what your child's social media usage is like and what their technology usage is like, not in, an imposing boundary breaking way, but just more, let's look at their usage on their phone. What are the hours a day that they're using? What app are they using the most? Being able to really understand what they're consuming, all the way up to content too, because that can be important as well. So that would be my first thing. And that's something that I'll do in session, is I'll say, if I'm with the teenager, hey, let me see like your phone usage, right? Just the hours. Let's talk about when you're using this, how you're using it. Are you using it to distract yourself, to avoid a tough conversation, to kind of dissociate from a hard feeling that you're having, right? Being able to understand what the function of it is, I think, is really important for teens. So that would be my
Dr. Kim, what about you?
Yeah, honestly, I dovetail that as well. Like, as soon as we have a deeper understanding of what the screen time is looking like for our teens, then starting to think about, okay, how is this impacting them in their day-to-day lives? Especially at a time right now where their prefrontal cortex is really in this increased developmental period, we want to be mindful about the foods that they're eating. We want to be mindful about how much sleep they're getting, how hydrated they are, what kind of interactions are they having with people offline or outside of the home. And so once we start to understand the amount of time it is that's being taken up by screen time, as well as the kind of content, then how can we ensure that their sleep is not getting interrupted, that they're getting sufficient amounts, and the rest of their lives is giving them opportunities to engage in tasks and in social interactions in the long term. Because I think one of the things with social media and screen time in general that specifically really impacts that prefrontal cortex development, and I mentioned it earlier, is just how it's almost the antithesis of each other, right? All the things that screen time and social media are taking up for us is the exact opposite of what we need to feed that brain to help it grow. So providing opportunities offline. So, having your kid and your teen interact with you in a way that is like they're part of the planning process. They're creating the grocery list. They're estimating how much time they need to spend on these things, and taking it outside of that. And then, seeing just in general how that can relate to the way that they live and they function in their day-to-day lives.
And if I could just add to that, because I think Jim's point is so important about the going offline. I've seen recently, even for myself, this idea of like analog hobby bags and things to replace the social media use, right? So if you're taking that away, what is going to be replaced? What's going to be there instead? And I've heard parents will come in and say, well, I just don't want my kids to be bored. That's really hard for me for my kids to be bored. I feel like I need to entertain them. And if I can't entertain them, let me put a screen in front of them. And so I work really hard with those families to say, hey, it's okay if your kid is bored. And what else are you offering for them? And so I love this idea. And I've done it myself with this new year to create a little analog hobby bag, whether it's a coloring book, maybe like, some bracelet making, just things that are inherently relaxing and creative and low cost also, that can just be a different thing that they can shift their focus. And as Kim was saying, that is a slower activity. You're not doing that in 30 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes, right? You're taking time. It's more effortful. It's slower. And you have to maintain your attention in order to complete that creative task.
Wow. I love that. Whenever I have these conversations with psychologists, I'm really happy I didn't raise my kids during that time. I raised my kids in a stage where I was like, you're bored? Great. Maybe something creative will happen. Maybe you'll do something you've never thought of before. But I know it's different. And I really don't judge parents. I mostly just feel a lot of, sympathy, really. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. And I think this was really powerful. I think what I'm hearing is that everybody struggles with executive function, and even adults right now with all of this screen time and all of this kind of instant gratification that all of us, our brains are literally changing. And so we get to choose, both for our children, but also for ourselves, opportunities to be able to practice all of those skills in different ways, whether it's habit stacking or gaining more attention or calendar blocking. And really there's benefits for everybody. What I also hear is that for students where it is kind of, I started off with like the panic, where we have a real deficit that's impacting their life in powerful ways. There are ways we can support them either through, and maybe not either through, but maybe it's both, is for instance, a psychologist who is trained on executive function and really understands how one could support executive function in therapy, because it's usually probably related to other things too, like anxiety and all those kinds of things. And then what's your take on executive function coaching? Have you seen it work? I didn't pay you guys to answer this question in any way, so you have to answer honestly.
Yeah, I have seen that executive functioning coaches have been a fabulous resource for kids. I think having worked both in the schools and in a private practice setting, I've gotten to see multiple angles of how that has been supportive for them. And I think especially when it's done in a way that really equips kids and walks them through the problem solving process of how to understand their own executive functions and then how to address that, it can be a really useful resource for them. And so I have referred to executive functioning coaches and continue to do so. And I'm just so grateful that we have folks like you, Laura, who have decided to step up to the plate and help our kids and our teens in this area, because as we've noticed, increasingly more so with time in society, this has been a really needed resource.
I feel like it's one of my top recommendations that I put in reports, because it feels like such a need, whether I'm, diagnosing more of a neurodevelopmental disorder or a social emotional one, right? And so it also helps us as therapists, as psychologists, to work on the other part of that, which is the anxiety, the depression that comes, the burnout, the impulse control, all of those things that we are highly trained to support families and kids with. Having an executive function coach is such a perfect complement to that, because then we can target both things instead of just picking one.
Yeah, I love it. I can't believe that that was 30 minutes, friends. Like, that was so fast. I want to have you back again, and I would love for you both to process after this, like, what should be our next topic. I think it's just so important to continue the conversation. One of the things that is hard for me sometimes is parents who come with the best of intention, but they say, you know, my kid is lazy, my kid won't do it, they're not motivated. I'm like, hold up, your student has a diagnosis of ADHD and executive function. Like, it's like asking someone in a wheelchair who has, you know, to jump up and run. It's just like it takes time, it takes effort, and I think the younger we start, and now that you're saying all this too, like, and then with reduced technology, which is huge, that we can really empower our kids. Listen, I can't thank you both enough. I have a long-standing relationship with Dr. Bedouin and Birch Psychology, and it's really nice to begin a new collaboration. So I'm really excited about it.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Oh, I think we can.
I think so. How do you feel how that went?
Great.